July always walked through town like someone balancing on a tightrope, calm on the outside, trembling just beneath the surface. People noticed the way her fingers curled around that handbag, knuckles pale, as if letting go would snap something inside her. She carried it everywhere, across the office floor, through crowded sidewalks, even into the bathroom stall without a second thought. Folks whispered about it in line at the bakery, calling her the woman welded to her purse. Some laughed, others shrugged, but everyone agreed on one thing: July was hiding something. And though she kept her lips sealed, her eyes often betrayed a fear she could never quite mask, a fear that hinted there was far more at stake than anyone realized. Neighbors told stories about her, not unkindly, just curious, stories of how she'd gently push away anyone who stood too close to the bag. At family gatherings, she'd keep it pressed against her side, even when offering a warm smile or a slice of pie. It wasn't vanity or distrust. It was something deeper, a weight she carried like a second heartbeat. Every morning she checked the clasp 3 times, and every night she slept with it under her pillow. The ritual wasn't habit, it was survival. And while others saw obsession, July knew she was guarding the one thing she could never afford to lose. Still, despite the discipline she lived by, there were moments, tiny flickers, when she longed to set the bag down, if only to breathe without its constant tug. But freedom wasn't meant for her, not with the legacy tied to that stitched leather. Sometimes, in the quiet before sunrise, she'd trace the bag's edge, remembering the voice of her grandmother and all the warnings that shaped her life. That voice still echoed in her mind, reminding her of the secret she must protect no matter how heavy it became. And though July tried to appear composed to the world, she felt time closing in, nudging her toward the moment she feared would eventually come, sooner than anyone expected. People often wondered what sparked such intensity in her, but July kept her past tucked away just as tightly as the bag itself. If anyone dared to ask, she'd smile softly, the kind of smile that said she understood their curiosity, but couldn't give them what they wanted. Behind that smile lived memories she'd spent years trying to keep dormant, nights filled with whispers she couldn't explain, mornings when her hands shook before she even touched the clasp. Those moments were stitched into her, shaping her into a woman who walked through life with quiet vigilance. She wasn't cold, she was cautious. And deep down, she wished someone, anyone, could truly understand why she moved through the world like someone guarding the last fragile piece of herself. At work, July's co-workers had long accepted her quirks. They joked gently about how her handbag deserved its own employee badge or its own seat at meetings. July laughed with them, but her laughter always felt borrowed, as if she were imitating a sound she used to make with ease. When she sat at her desk, she'd loop the bag's strap around her ankle, anchoring it to her like a lifeline. The small, familiar weight steadied her breathing, reminding her that no matter how her heart raced, she was still in control. Control was everything. It was the thread her life depended on, even when she felt it fraying in ways no one else could see. Yet there were flashes, brief, unguarded seconds, when exhaustion slipped through her defenses, moments when the world blurred and her shoulders sagged under all she carried. She'd catch herself imagining what it would feel like to set the bag on a chair, to step away from it, even for a heartbeat. That longing always came with guilt, twisted with fear, because she knew what could happen if she wasn't vigilant. Still, the desire lingered, whispering at the edges of her mind like a dangerous temptation. And little did she know, life was already steering her toward a moment where temptation and fatigue would collide in ways she had spent her entire life praying to avoid. Even at home, July moved with the same careful rhythm, as though each step had been rehearsed over years of quiet repetition. She'd place her keys on the table, slip off her shoes, but the bag never left her grasp. It followed her from the kitchen to the living room and into the shower, resting safely beside the sink where she could see it through the steam. Her home should have been a sanctuary, yet it felt more like a watchtower, every corner reminding her of what she protected and what she feared losing. The quiet was comforting but also cruel, amplifying thoughts she tried to bury, and sometimes the silence felt like it was listening. There were nights when she couldn't sleep, when memories stirred like ghosts tugging at her conscience. She'd sit at the edge of her bed with the bag nestled in her lap, tracing the familiar seams as if they could steady the tremble in her hands. Inside her chest, a knot tightened, fear, sorrow, responsibility woven together. She remembered her grandmother's voice, stern yet trembling, as she passed the burden to a much younger July who didn't understand the magnitude of the inheritance. Now, years later, July felt every ounce of it, heavier than she ever imagined. And though she honored her duty, she wondered who she might have been without it. In the soft glow of a bedside lamp, July sometimes whispered apologies, to herself, to her grandmother, maybe even to the life she never truly lived. She wasn't broken, but she carried cracks inside her, thin lines of pain only she could see. And while the world outside kept spinning, July remained anchored to this one object that defined her every move. She hoped no one ever had to know why, but life has a way of unraveling secrets at the moment you least expect, often with a single slip in routine. And July's moment was coming, inching closer with every tired breath she took. The morning July walked into the store, she carried exhaustion like a shadow clinging to her heels. Her eyes were heavy, her mind tangled in thoughts that refused to quiet. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight of the bag seemed almost too much to bear. She rubbed her temples as she stepped inside, greeted by the soft murmur of conversations and the bright hum of fluorescent lights that made everything feel harsher than it should. She wasn't herself that day, her movements slower, her focus scattered. Even the familiar comfort of holding the bag didn't ease her pulse. And in that fragile state, the smallest slip began to unfold. She approached the counter, meaning only to check a price tag, but her fingers faltered. Just for a second, she set the handbag down, letting her hand rest beside it as she leaned forward to see more clearly. It wasn't intention, it was instinct. The body seeking relief. Anyone watching wouldn't have thought twice about it. But July's heart stuttered, a signal she should have listened to, yet fatigue drowned it out. She inhaled sharply, trying to steady herself, unaware that someone across the aisle had noticed the rare sight of her bag resting unguarded. And in that tiny window of vulnerability, fate shifted. The stranger, a man with quick eyes and a restless posture, didn't seem remarkable at first glance. But the moment he spotted July's distraction, something changed in his stance. He glanced at the bag, then at her, recognition flickering like a spark. Maybe he'd heard the town's rumors. Maybe he just sensed opportunity. Either way, he moved before July even realized her hand was no longer touching the strap. And what happened next would shatter the careful world she'd built, setting off a chain of events she had feared her entire life. It happened so fast that July's mind struggled to catch up. One moment, the bag was sitting harmlessly on the counter, and the next it was gone, snatched by a blur of motion that barely registered in her tired vision. She blinked, confused, as if her brain refused to believe what her eyes had seen. But when her fingers reached out and touched only empty space, something inside her cracked open, her breath hitched, her knees weakened. Then reality struck her with a force she felt deep in her bones. Panic surged through her veins, sharp and cold, wiping away every trace of exhaustion. People around her turned when they heard her scream, raw, desperate, nothing like the quiet woman they knew. It wasn't the usual panic of someone losing a purse. This was the kind of fear that came from a place far darker. July's voice trembled as she begged for someone, anyone, to stop the thief. Her hands shook uncontrollably, and tears blurred the edges of her vision. The world tilted, unstable, as if the floor beneath her had been yanked away. She wasn't thinking about money or documents or anything normal people kept in handbags. Her mind screamed only one thing: it's loose now. The thief bolted toward the exit, weaving through shelves and startled shoppers. July tried to run after him, but her legs felt heavy, locked by dread. She could feel the weight of generations pressing on her chest, the memory of warnings she'd heard since childhood, echoing louder than the chaos around her. Her grandmother's voice whispered through the panic, reminding her of the rules she'd just broken, the rules she had sworn never to break. And as July stumbled out of the store, heart pounding, she knew that no matter how fast she ran, something far stronger than her fear had already been set in motion. Outside, the street erupted into chaos as voices collided, people shouting directions, trying to help, trying to understand why July looked as though her world had just collapsed. She pushed through the crowd with trembling hands, her breath sharp and uneven, each exhale carrying years of dread she had kept buried. Her eyes darted frantically from one passerby to another, searching for any sign of the man who now held the one thing she could never afford to lose. Every second felt like a lifetime slipping through her fingers. The air felt too thin, too bright, too loud, and July could feel her composure unraveling in ways she had spent decades fighting to avoid. A few bystanders joined the chase, fueled by the instinct to help a distressed woman, unaware of the true danger racing ahead of them. July tried to call out warnings, but her voice cracked under the weight of her terror. She wanted to tell them not to open it, not to touch the clasp, not to even breathe near it if they could help it, but the words tangled on her tongue, swallowed by adrenaline and fear. Her legs finally found strength, and she forced herself forward, driven not by hope, but by the crushing fear of what would happen if the bag was opened. She felt like she was running toward a storm she'd spent her entire life trying to outrun. As she hurried down the street, flashes of her past collided with the present, memories of her grandmother clutching her hands, eyes stern and scared, teaching her the rules that shaped her every move. July had always believed she'd have more time, more control, more vigilance, but now, watching the thief disappear around a corner, she realized that the moment she feared most had arrived, and whatever waited at the end of that chase would change everything, not just for her, but for anyone who crossed its path. Down the street, the chase twisted into a frantic blur of footsteps, shouts, and pounding hearts. The thief darted between startled pedestrians, gripping the bag tightly as if it were a prize he'd earned. He didn't look back, not once, driven by adrenaline and the thrill of what he believed was an easy steal. Behind him, the small crowd pushed forward, trying to keep him in sight, while July struggled to close the widening gap with her lungs burning. Every step she took felt like moving through thick, invisible mud, and with each heartbeat, she prayed that the latch on that cursed bag wouldn't give way. The thief veered sharply into a narrow alley, the kind of place people avoided at night, shadows pooling like ink around uneven brick walls. His breath came in ragged bursts as he leaned against the cold surface, trying to catch his breath. The bag dangled from his hand, heavier than he expected, almost unnaturally so. He frowned, curiosity flaring. If there was money inside, he thought, it must be a lot, maybe more than he'd dared hope for. And as he felt the weight shift, temptation tugged harder. The whisper of greed drowned out any distant cries or pounding footsteps behind him. With quick fingers and a pulse racing with excitement, he popped open the clasp. The sound echoed unnaturally, sharp and hollow, as if the air itself shuddered. A cold burst of wind surged from the bag, swirling around him like a breath from something ancient waking after a long sleep. Strange symbols flickered across the leather, glowing faintly before fading into the shadows. The thief blinked, confusion and fear clashing in his eyes. And then, just as he tried to step back, something unseen swept through him, chilling his bones and aging his face in a single horrifying heartbeat. When the others reached the mouth of the alley, they froze at the sight before them. The thief, once quick and youthful, now stood hunched over, his breath rattling like dry leaves in the wind. His hair, moments ago dark and thick, had turned a stark, ghostly white. Deep lines carved themselves across his face, as if a lifetime had unfolded in seconds. One of the men who had chased him let out a startled gasp, stumbling back as fear spread across his expression. No one knew what to make of it, but instinctively, they felt they were standing in the presence of something not meant to be witnessed. The air around them felt colder, heavier, as though the alley itself was holding its breath. The thief lifted his trembling hands to his face, his eyes wide with disbelief as he took in the new landscape of wrinkles and sagging skin. He tried to speak, but his voice broke into a thin, fragile whisper, full of terror he didn't have words for. The bag lay at his feet, open, silent now, almost innocent-looking, yet the chilling wind that had surged from it still clung to the walls, lingering like a warning no one could ignore. People exchanged horrified glances, each one silently asking the same question. What had they just seen? And beneath their fear was something deeper, something instinctive, an understanding that whatever had escaped that bag wasn't finished. Just then, July reached the entrance of the alley, her chest rising and falling with desperate breaths. But the moment she spotted the open bag, her expression collapsed into pure devastation. She didn't see the thief at first. She saw the curse, unleashed at last, the nightmare she had tried to hold back for years. Her hand flew to her mouth, and tears filled her eyes, not out of shock, but out of the painful recognition that her worst fear had come true. The others stared at her, waiting for an explanation, and July knew that the time for secrecy was over, even if the truth was something no one was prepared to hear. July stepped closer, her legs trembling as though the curse itself had drained the strength from her body. She knelt beside the thief, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and dread. He looked up at her with a pleading gaze, silently begging for answers, for help, for something she didn't know how to give. His breath shivered in the air, each exhale thinner than the last. July reached for the bag with shaking hands, careful not to touch its open mouth, as if even proximity might pull her into the same fate. The crowd watched her every move, the terror in their eyes slowly giving way to confused expectation. They sensed she knew something they didn't, and needed desperately to understand. The alley was silent except for the thief's labored breathing, echoing softly off the narrow walls. July swallowed hard, her throat tight with guilt as she took in the full reality before her. She had failed her duty, the duty passed down through generations of her family, each guardian warning the next never to let this exact moment occur. Her grandmother's face flashed in her mind, stern yet full of love, reminding her at 8 years old that their family's curse was not a story, but a responsibility. And now, looking at the thief's aged body, July felt the crushing weight of breaking that promise, one she hadn't made lightly. It wasn't just fear filling her chest. It was grief, heavy and sharp. Behind her, the witnesses edged closer, hesitant but compelled, their expressions demanding the truth. July could feel their questions pressing into her back, each one sharper than the last. What happened? What's in the bag? Why is he aging like this? She inhaled shakily, trying to gather the strength to speak the words she had spent her whole life avoiding. The wind tugged gently at her hair, as though urging her forward, reminding her that silence could no longer protect anyone. And as July prepared to face the faces waiting behind her, the truth she had guarded for so long began to rise inside her, ready to reshape everything they thought they knew. July stood slowly, wiping her palms on her skirt as if trying to rub away the tremor in them. The faces around her were tight with fear and confusion, waiting for an explanation she had prayed she'd never have to give. She swallowed, tasting the metallic sting of dread on her tongue, and forced herself to meet their eyes. This wasn't just a theft, she began, her voice soft but steady. A hush fell over the alley, the kind of silence that feels heavy enough to bend the air. July could feel her heart pounding, but she pushed through it, knowing there was no turning back. The truth was no longer hers to protect alone. She glanced at the thief, now an old man in a young man's clothes, before returning her gaze to the crowd. "The bag carries a spell," she said, the words nearly catching in her throat. "A curse passed through the women in my family." Her breath shook as she spoke, memories flickering through her mind, candle-lit rooms, whispered warnings, her grandmother's trembling hands clasped around her own. July felt as though she were peeling open old wounds, exposing the fear she'd carried since childhood. "Anyone who opens it," she continued, "absorbs the curse, aging faster than time can keep up." Gasps rippled through the group, a wave of disbelief mixed with fear. As she spoke, July felt the past uncurl inside her, pulling her backward to moments she had buried deep. She remembered being 9 years old, sitting cross-legged on her grandmother's worn rug, as the old woman's voice trembled with urgency. She remembered the way the house smelled of lavender and wood smoke, the way the shadows danced along the walls as her grandmother explained their family's task: protect the bag, keep it sealed, never let it fall into the wrong hands. Those memories felt like a distant echo now, yet painfully vivid, as if her grandmother's presence hovered beside her in the alley. And July knew that the story she was about to reveal would only get harder from here. July took a slow breath, the kind that shivered through her chest before it settled. "My grandmother was the guardian before me," she said, her voice softening with the memory, "and her mother before her." The pattern stretched back further than she could track, a thread woven through generations of women who had all carried the same burden. She could still see her grandmother's eyes, kind yet weighed down by years of silent fear, as she handed July the bag on the night of her 12th birthday. It had been wrapped in faded cloth, smelling faintly of sage and old paper. "You must never open it," her grandmother had whispered, a hint of desperation in her tone. "And you must never let anyone else open it either." That night, July had felt both honored and terrified, even before she understood the true cost of the responsibility. The witnesses listened with growing unease, their expressions shifting between disbelief and a dawning realization that the impossible might actually be real. July could sense their skepticism melting, replaced by something heavier: concern, maybe even sympathy. One woman stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why your family?" July hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the sky as if searching for an answer there. "Because someone long before us tampered with things they shouldn't have," she finally said. "A spell meant to bring protection twisted into something far more dangerous, and once it attached to our bloodline, it needed a keeper, someone to hold it, contain it, carry it." The words felt like ash on her tongue. It had never been a choice. It had been a destiny handed down like a chain she could never break. Her hands tightened around the bag as she continued, feeling the stitched leather press into her skin, like a reminder of the oath she had tried so hard to honor. "Every guardian before me sacrificed something," she said, her voice thickening. "Time with family, freedom, safety, even simple moments of peace." July blinked back tears, not wanting them to fall here, in front of strangers, though they no longer felt like strangers. "We aren't allowed to slip, not even for a second." Her gaze lowered to the thief once more, his breaths shallow, his body trembling. "And today, I slipped." The confession cracked in the air, fragile and heavy all at once, and the weight of it settled over the crowd like a shadow that stretched far beyond the alley. July lowered herself beside the thief again, her knees pressing into the cold pavement, as if grounding her in the moment she wished she could undo. "This curse doesn't stop," she said quietly, her fingers hovering near his trembling shoulder, but not quite touching. "Once it starts, time accelerates, faster and faster." The man's eyes, now clouded with age, flickered with fear and confusion, and July felt a familiar ache twist inside her. She wanted to promise him something: comfort, a cure, even hope. But the truth offered none of that. Around her, the crowd remained silent, the gravity of her words settling into their bones, and for the first time, July allowed them to see the burden she had carried alone. She sat back slightly, drawing in a breath that felt thick with memory. "I used to ask my grandmother why we couldn't just destroy the bag," she said, her voice softening like a candle flickering in a draft. "I thought fire would end it, or burying it, or locking it away forever." She gave a tired, hollow smile. "But she told me the curse isn't in the leather or the clasp, it's in what's bound to it. Destroy the vessel, and the curse escapes. It has to be contained, carried." The crowd shifted uneasily, exchanging looks filled with dread. They were only beginning to understand the impossible tightrope July had walked her entire life. And July knew that sharing this truth didn't ease the burden. It only made it real for everyone watching. Her eyes drifted toward the entrance of the alley, where the light spilled softly across the asphalt, as though urging her forward into a future she wasn't ready to face. "She always said I would know when the curse was at risk of awakening," July murmured, "and that when that day came, I'd have to choose whether to run, reveal the truth, or face the consequences." She brushed her thumb over the edge of the bag, feeling its silent pulse against her palm like a reminder that her role as guardian was far from over. The witnesses stood quietly, waiting, sensing that July's story wasn't done. And somewhere deep inside her, July felt the first signs of a new, unwelcome decision rising, one that would shape everything that came next. The alley slowly emptied as bystanders slipped away, whispering among themselves, glancing back at July as though she had become someone entirely new, someone they weren't sure how to approach. July didn't blame them. Even she felt unfamiliar to herself, stripped of the secrecy she'd worn like armor for so many years. She stayed by the thief's side, helping him inch to his feet, though his frail body trembled with every movement. The weight of responsibility pressed hard against her chest, responsibility not only for the curse, but for the human being it had claimed. People had always seen July as quiet, odd, maybe a touch reclusive. Now they saw something else, a woman bound to something unimaginable. And July felt that shift like a cold wind brushing the back of her neck. She guided the thief toward the end of the alley, one slow step at a time, the bag held tightly against her side as though it could still slip away. His once strong hands clung to her arm, desperate, confused, terrified. July kept her voice soft, soothing, promising she would not abandon him, even though she knew she couldn't undo what had happened. The town, always curious, always buzzing with rumors, watched her pass with a mix of pity and fear. Mothers pulled their children closer, shopkeepers peeked through windows, and July felt each stare, sharp and heavy, carving new vulnerabilities she wasn't ready to face. But she couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything. They reached a quiet bench near the edge of the street, and July eased him down gently. The thief, now a man who looked decades older than he truly was, closed his eyes, breath thin and weary. July sat beside him, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles paled. She didn't know what the coming days would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away from the consequences. Her family legacy had touched this man, reshaped him in ways neither of them could comprehend. Caring for him wasn't just morality, it was duty. And whether she was ready or not, the decisions waiting ahead would demand more from her than she'd ever given before. As the afternoon light softened, July felt the quiet around her deepen into something almost suffocating. The thief rested beside her, his breath shallow yet steady, as if clinging to each moment with the fragile determination of someone who knew time was slipping through his fingers. July watched him, guilt tightening in her chest with every rise and fall of his thin shoulders. She wondered who he had been before this, whether he had family waiting for him, dreams he hadn't yet lived, regrets he never imagined would matter. The curse didn't just age the body, it stole futures. And knowing she had played a role in awakening, it made her heart ache with a weight she wasn't sure she could bear. Yet, she wasn't allowed the luxury of falling apart. The townspeople gathered in small clusters nearby, whispering behind cupped hands, their gazes flicking toward July like they were trying to solve a puzzle that frightened them. A few faces held compassion, but others were shadowed with suspicion, as though they feared she might be carrying something contagious, something that could spill out again if she wasn't careful. July kept her shoulders squared and her breath steady, but inside, she felt small and exposed. She had spent her life mastering the art of invisibility, blending into routines, letting the bag be her shield. Now she could feel that shield cracking. And the town no longer saw her as the quiet woman with strange habits. They saw her as the keeper of something terrifying. As she traced the bag's familiar edges with her fingertips, July felt a tremor of uncertainty ripple through her. She had always known her role as guardian wasn't meant to last forever. Every generation faced the same choice: keep carrying the curse, try to destroy it and risk unleashing what lay inside, or pass the burden on to someone else. Until today, she had never considered the third option, never wanted to. But now, with the curse awakened and the thief suffering beside her, she wondered if she could continue alone. The thought felt like a betrayal and a relief all at once, stirring emotions she didn't dare name. And as the sun dipped lower, July realized a decision was inching toward her, quiet and inevitable. As the sky darkened into soft shades of blue and violet, July felt the weight of the moment settle differently, less like a burden pressing her down and more like a crossroads rising beneath her feet. The thief stirred beside her, his voice barely more than a whisper as he asked, "What happens to me now?" The question fractured something inside her. She wished she had an answer that offered comfort or even clarity, but the truth was as unsettling as the curse itself. "I'll help you," she said quietly, her voice steady even as her heart trembled. "I won't let you face this alone." The promise anchored her. It reminded her that, guardian or not, she still had a choice in the kind of person she would be. As she sat there, she began to notice small things, details she had never allowed herself to see before. The way the bag pulsed with a faint, unsettling warmth, now that the spell had been disturbed. The way shadows seemed to cling to its edges, as though waiting for another opening, and the way her own hands tingled when she touched it, a sensation she had felt only once before, the night her grandmother passed the guardianship to her. That memory resurfaced vividly, her grandmother's frail fingers closing July's hands around the bag, her voice weak but certain as she said, "One day, this burden may not be yours anymore." Until now, July had never understood the weight of those words, but tonight, she felt them settle into her bones. The thief opened his eyes again, searching her face for something, maybe reassurance, maybe answers, maybe hope. July met his gaze, and for the first time, she let herself imagine a different future, a future where she wasn't the only one carrying the curse, a future where she could teach someone, guide them, maybe even share the load that had shaped every moment of her life. It scared her, that thought, but it also stirred something else. Relief, possibility, something quietly brave. And as the night deepened around them, July sensed that the curse, though contained for now, was far from done weaving its path forward. Something lingered in the air, waiting, hinting that the story was far from over.